Hi, Professor Jeffrey Utzinger here again. Today we're going to talk about Henry David Thoreau and his work Walden. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Thoreau. He was born in Concord, Massachusetts, where he spent the majority of his life, and Concord is just outside of Boston, so we're considering another American as a romantic writer. Thoreau was part of a group that became known as the Transcendentalist writers. We'll talk a little bit more about Transcendentalism when we discuss Whitman. But for today, I want to look at Thoreau's work and what specifically is romantic about it, and then anything else that I find interesting to share with you. Thoreau died tragically in his early 40s, which to some of you may seem like a long life, but to others of you would also call that a young man, and certainly in the line of the other romantic writers we looked at thus far, certainly did not live a long life. Thoreau, interestingly enough, also died of tuberculosis, as did John Keats. But Thoreau got in quite a bit of writing before his untimely death. He did die just right after the Civil War began, so he missed that part of American history. But certainly the political atmosphere in America leading up to the Civil War influenced a lot of Thoreau's work. His family, mainly his mothers and his sisters, were very active in the abolitionist cause. And Thoreau, even though he didn't like to write about slavery much, certainly helped out in that cause. His family helped shelter several folks along the Underground Railroad, and then also set up many abolitionists in their home, and also made it possible for them to speak in Concord and the surrounding areas. For our discussion today, we want to focus in on a two-year period in Thoreau's life when he went to live at Walden Pond. Now, interesting thing about Thoreau, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the work, is that he was really looking for a way to live and not necessarily have to work every minute of the day in order to make a living. It's a big part of what he is trying to accomplish in Walden. One of the ways that he was able to live a simple life is he lived with his parents for most of the time. His father and brother and he made pencils, which I always find to be an interesting occupation. Don't know too many pencil makers these days. But also he was great friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was himself rather wealthy for the time. And when Thoreau decides to move to Walden Pond and live for a couple of years, the land that he builds his cabin on was owned by Emerson himself. So let's kind of delve into the text itself. I'm going to be reading from my own copy. I've had it since I was in high school. I read all of Walden every couple of years, so it is an important, significant text in my own life. But I want to just tell you a little bit about what surrounds the chapters that I had you read for today. Excuse me. So chapter 1 of Walden, and the work itself is about 300 pages, is called Economy. And what Thoreau does is he lays out what economy means in kind of two different ways. One, what would it look like if we created our own personal economy? So if you're thinking about romanticism in terms of individuality, Thoreau certainly championed individual effort. But then also, what does it mean to be economical, right? In the way that we typically think of the word today. How can you get the most out of the least amount of perhaps money, maybe even perhaps effort, so that you can spend your time doing things that you really enjoy doing if work isn't something that you enjoy. So in that first chapter, he tells us about how he made his way to the pond, where he got the materials to build the cabin that he built. And there's a lovely passage about buying a house that was in ill repair, more like a shack, I guess you would say, and how he and some other of his friends tear it down after he purchases it and then uses it to rebuild a house near Walden Pond. And then one of the things Thoreau likes to do is give us exact numbers. This is how frugally I was able to live. This is what it cost for all the materials for the house that I built. This is how much I spent on food, because he gardened and was a vegetarian for much of that time period because it was the cheapest way to eat. So he likes to give us lots of numbers. Before we delve into the specific chapter we looked at for today, I also want to have you keep in mind, I always like to think of Walden, there's kind of two Waldens, if you will. The Walden that Thoreau writes about kind of in a you are there moment, right, when he's giving us very specific details about what's going on. And then the Walden where Thoreau really becomes the philosopher, steps back and tries to assign a larger meaning to the way that he lived. We kind of get this effect because Thoreau lived in that cabin next to Walden Pond for 2 years, but he tells us early in the text that he condenses those 2 years into 1 year. So one of the ways that Walden is set up is kind of seasonally. He moves there in the summer, and then the chapters kind of follow the seasons for a full year, even though he lived there for 2 years. So time and space collapses a little bit in Walden because we've got 2 versions of summer that he rolls into one, 2 versions of fall, and so on. And then, after he decides to leave Walden, which in fact he does, he spends 7 years editing and rewriting this text before it's finally published. So I think that's part of what gives it that effect of immediate memories that he's recorded in the text, and then in those 7 years afterwards, him reflecting on that. And there's really not a clear separation between those two things. A lot of times that shift happens within one paragraph, or at the very least within one page, where he's focusing down in on specific details and then drifting back. In the passages that come after the section that I had you read for today, it's pretty interesting. Because in that first chapter, he says, I went out into the woods in order to figure out how to live deliberately. And actually, I think he mentions that in the chapter that we looked at for today. And find out what the necessities of life are. And then, once he finds out what the necessity of life is, which really boils down to heat, we need clothing, we need food to keep that internal engine going, we need shelter, and a couple of other things. Then he begins to lay out in the rest of the book how, once he had decided what the bare necessities are, how he spent his time. There's a chapter on reading. Thoreau was a prodigious reader throughout his life, and he had tons of books with him in that tiny cabin in Walden, which, by the way, if you're ever in Concord, Massachusetts, you should definitely go to Walden Pond. It is a national park. You can swim in Walden Pond. I've done it on several occasions. And then also near the entrance of the park, there's a replica of Thoreau's cabin. The cabin fell down, deteriorated not long after Thoreau's death. It kind of disappeared. Some scholars have identified where it actually was, but the Park Service built a replica of the cabin so that people can at least see how big it was. And we're not talking about a large space at all. It definitely is the essence of living economically. But then in the rest of the chapters, like I said, there's a chapter on reading. There's a chapter on noises, sounds. He records what he heard as he worked. He tells us about hoeing in his bean fields and gardening and the experiments he made then. Spends lots of time talking about the pond itself, what it looks like during the summer times, and then when it freezes over in the winter, his observations there. Really a rather fascinating book. One more thing about Thoreau, kind of about his legacy. Walden was not particularly well received. It sold okay when it came out, but it really wasn't until the early part of the 20th century where people began to think about environmentalism that Thoreau's work really achieved its heyday. It's had quite a bit of impact on things like the Sierra Club and other folks who are interested in environmentalism, preserving natural spaces so that we can enjoy. And then you may have heard of Thoreau's civil disobedience. Hopefully a good high school teacher once upon a time had you read that. But civil disobedience in many ways is a direct response to slavery. While Thoreau is at Walden Pond, he refuses to pay his poll tax because he feels like a government that supports slavery is not something that he wants to support. And he spends a night in jail and is released the next day. An aunt or a family member pays the poll tax, which also irritates him. But as a result of that, he writes Civil Disobedience, the idea of nonviolent protest against unjust laws. Many folks have suggested, of course, that this civil disobedience inspired the likes of Gandhi, who took civil disobedience not just as one night in the jail, but his kind of life work. And then also Martin Luther King Jr. In America during the civil rights movement, really championing nonviolence. And then some people have even linked that to, you may remember the Unabomber, who certainly lived in a cabin in the woods. His civil disobedience had a tinge of violence because he did mail bombs to people who he felt like supported technology a little too much. Not real comfortable with the Unabomber connection, but there are some parallels. All that said, let's dive into the section that we looked at for today, where I lived and what I lived for. Now, there's some mythology that surrounds Thoreau, that he was a hermit, that he didn't like society, and it's just not true. He did live in seclusion for those 2 years when he was in Walden, but he leaves that seclusion. For him, it was an experiment to see how simply he could live. And even all throughout Walden, he's talking about the people that he's meeting, the people that he's talking to. And in that first paragraph there, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, he says, I dearly love to talk. He loves to interact with other people. The idea, I think, that we can take away from Walden is that Thoreau is championing the idea that we do need to check out of society, that we do need to retreat from time to time, spend time every day, or at least every week or every month whenever we can, in seclusion, in natural places, to recharge our batteries, and then re-enter society, right? We become better members of society when we spend time, from time to time, in seclusion. Some of the things I'm going to look at in the chapter that I have you look at for today, those first couple of pages. Thoreau is a surveyor by trade. He makes some of his money when he chooses to work by surveying property. And so he travels all over the Concord and Lexington area, and he knows it quite well. And here's where I really think captures the romantic spirit early on. And he talks about how whenever he travels and looks at farmland, he kind of pities the farmer because they're tied to that land all the time. They have to produce. And that he thought once upon a time about buying a farm himself, and became very close. But he says, let me see, I'm just going to jump into that very long paragraph that begins, my imagination carried me far. I found thus that I had been a rich man without any damage to my poverty, but I returned the landscape, and I have since annually carried off what it yielded without a wheelbarrow. With respect to landscapes, quote, I am a monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. I have frequently seen a poet withdraw, having enjoyed the most valuable part of the farm, while the crusty farmer supposed that he had got a few wild apples only. Here, Thoreau really taps into that idea of imagination. And also, I think in many ways, philosophically, he's closest to Wordsworth, and Wordsworth really valued the imagination. I call that intentional imagination. But Thoreau says that we can enjoy landscapes if we spend time in them, if we study them, and if some ways we memorize them in our imagination. And really, we're all the more rich spiritually if we don't have to pay the bills and work the land all the time. In our own reflection, we can enjoy those places in our mind. And I think that's a lot of what Walden is about. I just want to point out that there's a break in that first section, and then he begins, the present was my next experiment of this kind. And just want to point out, he mentions several times that it took him a while to build the cabin and get things set up, but then he moves into Walden his cabin on Walden Pond on the 4th of July. Now he mentions it as just so happens. He says, "When I first took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as my days there, which by accident was on Independence Day or the 4th of July, 1845. I would argue that it's no accident that Thoreau tells us that he moves in on the 4th of July. He is an American after all, and I would suggest that his experiment at Walden Pond is his own declaration of independence. He's going to live in a new way for several years, and the 4th of July is a very significant date for him. I want to go into the heart of this essay. There's some things that really capture why he moves in there. So several pages beyond where he mentions he moves in on the 4th of July, he quotes some poetry again. "There was a shepherd that did live." And I want to look at the several paragraphs that follow that. There's one that begins, "Every morning was a cheerful invitation to make my life of equal simplicity." And for the next couple of pages, Thoreau really lays out his philosophy of living. He talks about how he's a morning person. And I know a lot of people kind of cringe when they read this part of Walden. They're like, well, I'm not a morning person. That wouldn't work for me. But the thing you want to keep in mind with Thoreau is he's not suggesting to his reader, I think you should be a morning person. I think you should move to the woods for several years. But rather, he suggests you should find some way to live romantically. You should find what works for you. Where is that place that recharges your batteries? What is that time of day when you feel most alive, most awake, most creative, regardless of what your own personal situation is and how you make a living? Are there ways that you can discover within your day-to-day routine to really be awake and alive? He mentions several times about, I'm just going to read to you from the middle of that really long paragraph. "Morning is when I am awake and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. Why is it that men give so poor an account of their day if they have not been slumbering? They are not such poor calculators. If they had not been overcome with drowsiness, they would have performed something. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to be poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive." For Thoreau, that's really the essence. Figure out how to wake yourself up and how to live as though you are truly and fully alive. In the next paragraph, he lays out why he tried this experiment. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." So for Thoreau, 2 words really are key: simplicity and sincerity. For Thoreau, he felt like human beings should figure out how to live sincere, authentic lives. And the best way to do that is at some point strip away all the things that distract us, live simplistically or simply, and once we do that, we are able to be sincere human beings. He highlights that idea several times in the next pages: simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. And again, for Thoreau, he was a single man. He was able to generate enough income and live in such a way that he could simplify. But it doesn't mean that he's arguing the same things for you and me. What ways can we simplify our lives in order to live in a more simplistic way, in a more sincere way? A couple more things in this chapter. I could spend the rest of the day talking about this entire book, but I think it's important to just hit some more highlights. At some point towards the end, he kind of rails against newspapers, and he says newspapers are full of gossip, and only old ladies over tea are reading them. In a lot of Thoreau's writing, he is railing against newspapers. Make no mistake, Thoreau paid very close attention to newspapers. He might not have been happy in what people were reporting on, because he felt like people were being gossipy and reporting on things that were frivolous And if we really wanted to know what the news of the world, what the world had to offer us, we should go outside and experience nature. But he's always talking about newspapers, which suggests that he reads them quite a bit. I want to go there to the very end and look at the second to last page, or the second to last paragraph. Let us spend one day as deliberately as nature, and not be thrown off track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls on the rails. Now for Thoreau, he found the most meaning in life in nature. He felt like nature acted very deliberately, right? That there was a reason for the seasons, and the more that we studied nature, the more we would understand ourselves. I would argue that maybe nature isn't your thing. Maybe there is another thing that you can go deeply into in your occupation or your avocation, the things that you enjoy, that you don't get paid for. And really to live a life deliberately is to live deeply in some sort of topic or some sort of setting. And then he wraps up this chapter with one of my favorite lines. Last paragraph begins, "Time is but the stream I go fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin currents slide away, but eternity remains." Thoreau liked to mess with the concept of time, if you will, by collapsing those 2 years into one, by sharing his reflections that really span over almost a decade, the 2 years he lives there and the 7 years that he spends editing it. He likes to think about how one specific place changes over time and what things stay the same. He likes to reflect on what the pond looks like in the summertime and then again what it looks like when it's frozen over the winter. So hopefully you enjoyed this one chapter from Walden, and that if you haven't read the entire text, I would encourage you to do that someday. Spend some time looking at how a man really got serious about experimenting in life, doing something out of the ordinary, and think about ways that you can simplify your own life, whatever that might mean for you, but also how you can live deliberately and become as sincere a person as you possibly can be. Thanks.